evening. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. My name is Sam Kaplan. I'm a faculty member here at UNC Asheville and serve as the director of the Center for Jewish Studies. I appreciate you choosing to attend this annual Phyllis Freed Solid Memorial Lecture. The lecture is named for Phyllis Freed Solid, who was an active member in the Asheville Jewish community throughout the 50s and 60s. This lecture was made possible by an endowment established by her husband, Dr. Normal Solid, to bring a nationally known Jewish scholar to our campus. It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Orit Avishai, a distinguished professor of sociology and women and gender and sexuality studies at Fordham University, where she is also affiliated with the Center for Jewish Studies. Dr. Avishai's academic journey is both diverse and impressive. She earned her Bachelor of Law from Tel Aviv University Law School in 1994, followed by a Bachelor of Law from Yale Law School in 1996. She then got her master's and PhD in sociology at the University of California, Berkeley, finishing her doctorate in 2007. Her research interests encompass American religion and politics, illiberalism, gender, religion, sexuality, and Jewish studies. As an ethnographer, Dr. Avishai delves into how ideology and culture shape social institutions, identities, political dialogues, cultural practices, and knowledge production. Her scholarly work has been featured in journals such as Gender and Society and the Journal for the Scientific Study of Religion. In 2023, Dr. Avishai published her groundbreaking book, Queer Judaism, LGBT activism, and the remaking of Jewish orthodoxy in Israel. Tonight's talk will cover a lot of that ground. Beyond her publications, Dr. Avishai is recognized for her contributions to public scholarship. She was selected for the Carpenter Cohort by Sacred Writes in 2023, which is a program that trains scholars to engage with broader audiences on issues of gender and sexuality. Her dedication to teaching is equally commendable. Students describe her as intelligent, clear, and dynamic, noting that her lectures are engaging and promote critical thinking as well as active participation. Dr. Avishai's work exemplifies the impact of combining rigorous academic research with a commitment to social justice and community engagement. Her insights challenge us to reconsider our assumptions and broaden our understanding of identity, faith, and activism. Please join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Orit Avishai.
Thank you, Dr. Kaplan. I believe you did what I have not done throughout my career and go on ratemyprofessor.com to see what my students say about me. So thank you for that. Okay, so hello, everyone. It is wonderful to be here in Asheville, although I hear it is going to be snowing tonight, which is very sad for someone coming from the Northeast. So I will talk to you today about queer Judaism, but a few preliminaries. So before I start, I want to acknowledge that I'm giving this talk at a time when everything Israel related is fraught. That has been true for forever, but especially since October 7th, 2023. So it always feels like we're in a catch-22, talk about something else, and you're missing a big part of the story. On the other hand, we want to have other kinds of conversations about Israeli politics, culture, society, in part in order to understand what it means to be in a world post October 7th. So I'm kind of going to do both in the sense that what I have to say will resonate with a post-October 7th, but I'm going to stick to my lane. I'm an ethnographer. This is what I know to talk about, and that's where my focus will be. So I want to share with you today what I learned over the course of 6 years of research working with queer Orthodox Jews in Israel, as captured in my book. And the book centers on queer Jewish experiences and activism in Israel. But really, what it's about is the evolving relationship between Judaism, Orthodox Judaism in particular, and queer identities. In a nutshell, if you have to leave, so you know what you will miss. Um, Orthodox Judaism in Israel in particular has gone through an unprecedented change when it comes to LGBTQ plus acceptance within about 15-year period starting in the mid 2000s. And oh, the mic closer. Sorry, is this better? Okay, thank you. Thank you for letting me know. Um, so what the puzzles I kind of think about is like, how did this happen? Why did this happen? And what are the implications for queer Orthodox Jews, but also for the community, for their families, and for society at large? There are also two larger stories here. And the first is, how does Orthodox Judaism respond to demands that it change from within its community, from with people who identify as Orthodox Jews? And the second story is sort of the broader political story. How does a community, whether it's a religious community or society at large, deal with questions of diversity, social change, and really democracy? And I'll make those connections clear. So, in what follows, I'm going to talk about three things. I'm going to talk about lived experiences. What does it mean to be? How does it feel to be Orthodox queer person in Israel in the first decades of this century? I'll talk about activism, how Orthodox queer persons working together made achieved immense social change within a relatively short period of time, and the relationship between queerness and orthodoxy. And then I want to talk about something that's obviously not in the book, but is very relevant to audiences here, is what people, what we should know about the relationship between orthodoxy and queer demands for queer acceptance and changes to communities here, and some of the larger political arena around that. So, a little bit of context. In Israel, the backdrop to understanding anything about Orthodox Judaism is to remember that the political culture in Israel is such that religion is really interwoven with the fabric of the state. Illiberalism, some would call those anti-democratic forces, have been on the rise for a long time, even before the big protest movement that sort of erupted as a result of demands to making changes to the judicial system. But these illiberal or anti-democratic forces are closely associated with orthodoxy, but are not only Orthodox. So Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, if you follow Israeli politics, would be part of that camp. And as I mentioned, queer Judaism is also a pre-October 7th story. And that has a lot of implications for understanding some of the questions that many Orthodox Jews or the queer community in Israel and many progressive American Jews grapple with, is the sense of loss of allyship with other previously natural sort of communities of affinity. So part of the processes that I will talk about will maybe shed light on some of that. So one more thing that I want to do before I kind of delve into this story is sort of a little bit of terminology. So I'm going to use orthodoxy kind of as sort of a catch-all, but I'm referring to what we think of in the US as modern Orthodox. And in Israel, we think of as dati in Hebrew, or religious Zionist camp. So not ultra-Orthodox, not Haredi, just to be clear on that. I'm going to be using LGBT, LGBTQ+, queer interchangeably. that is a little bit problematic for all sorts of reasons, but bear with me. Just I'm going to do that kind of for shorthand, but I will note that there are reasons for using other kinds of terminology. And lastly, conservative, the way I use it, I don't mean conservative synagogue or conservative denomination. I mean conservative, like people who are politically, socially conservative. So small c, not capital C. Okay, so a little bit of who I am and what I did. So I spent several years, as I said, studying what's known in Israel as the proud religious community, Kehila Datit Ge'ah in Hebrew, KADAG is the acronym. And I came to this project as a complete outsider. I was raised in Israel, but I am not Orthodox and I do not identify as queer, and everyone I worked with knew that about me. And the reason I got to this research as I've been studying Orthodox communities for a very long time, but my focus had been on gender. But I also teach at a Catholic university, so at Fordham University's Catholic Jesuit, and many of the students in my classes who would take my gender sexuality classes had been raised Catholic. And as you can imagine, many of the kids who show up at gender sexuality courses are questioning or identify as queer. And they came with questions about their Catholic upbringing, and that led me to begin to think about and reflect about the religion that I knew best. So my students were really a push and an impetus for this research. So let me start with a couple of personal stories, kind of to set the stage of people. And these are composites, and I've changed a lot of identifying information, but the stories are authentic and reflect people who I met while doing research. So Ayelet, I met for the first time in 2017, and there were many people who I met several times throughout the course of my research. And she said that she was mourning, quote, the picture of what life was supposed to look like. She was closeted, late 20s, occasionally dated men. She had hoped to be able to marry a man and have, quote, a real wedding with a huppah, that would be the wedding canopy, and a shattered glass, which is part of the wedding ceremony, rather than shattered dreams. She had known from a young age that something was, quote, wrong with her, that she was, quote, different. Her friends would speak endlessly about boys, but then she kept having crushes about her female youth group counselors and teachers and friends, etc. So, and she would pray, quote, I prayed for this to change, that I'll be normal, her words. So I caught up with her a couple years later. She was still closeted, celibate, and she said she felt stuck. By that point, everyone around her basically had married and they were beginning to have children. And in Orthodox circles, marriage rates are very high. People tend to get married kind of young. And they went back and settled in the kinds of places that she grew up in. In her case, a West Bank settlement. She said she couldn't, that's the life she imagined. She couldn't go live there as a single woman. But the most painful part for her was that she couldn't imagine herself with a same-sex partner. She also felt that she was drifting away from Orthodoxy because the things that she loved most about it, family, community, she felt that she had no part in that because she couldn't achieve that family. So she said she was stuck. She was stuck. She couldn't imagine herself with a woman, and yet this other life wasn't accessible to her. And she said that lifelong messages from family, teachers, and rabbis ran too deep. And her father is a well-known Orthodox rabbi, which made coming out and accepting herself doubly hard. Another person I met is Benny, who realized he was gay in very early adolescence. And he said that his bar mitzvah, he felt like a hypocrite because he knew that he was never going to be able to fully achieve Jewish male adulthood, again, because that included a family with a wife and children. He got a cell phone. When he got a cell phone, one of his first calls was to a very prominent conversion therapy organization. And this is something that I heard over and over again, especially from the men. And the contact told him, don't worry about it. There's time for you to change. And again, that was a narrative that came up in many of the interviews that I did. So, okay, he was told that he was going to change to, so wait. So he just waited. But then in the meantime, he kept having crushes on his friends, on his male youth group counselors. And at one point, a rabbi referred him to a therapist rumored to help young men in his situation. That turned out to be conversion therapy. And that also led to a crisis of faith because here is a trusted rabbi who had sent him to this kind of therapy. Then he joined a conservative men's group organization that encouraged celibacy or opposite sex marriage for gays and lesbians. So he did find emotional support there. And of course, he met his first boyfriend there. And again, that was a recurring story. But he said that it didn't make this thing, as he called it, go away. And then everything became urgent. His friends were getting married. His younger siblings were getting married. There were several of them. And his life plan was upended. He was going to move back to his neighborhood in Jerusalem. He was going to be a teacher at a Orthodox school. None of that was going to be possible as a gay man. But he had kind of a happier ending, and I've actually kept in touch with him over the years. He ended up partnering with an ex-Orthodox or disaffiliated Orthodox man. They have had 2 kids since then. And they have found a community, one of several that's operating in Israel, that's sort of accepting communities that they actually helped found and sort of turn into a major sort of source of support. And what he said that the changing point for him was that he decided that he was not going to be living for other people. He was going to be living for himself, which is a major thing because Jewish ethics is very communally oriented. It's not necessarily about your own well-being and happiness. That was one thing. And the other thing is that he came to identify as Orthodox and gay. And again, that's what he and his cohort were able to do, is to create this new kind of identity that didn't exist as an Orthodox gay. So I start with these 2 stories because they capture key way stations in the lives of many same-sex attracted people that I talk to. This idea of a shattered life plan, a chaotic aftermath. And then from that mess, a new life plan, a reimagining, but not just their own life plans, but a reimagining what orthodoxy actually is and could be. And again, remember the context here is that people's personal lives are deeply entangled with their communities and with the broader political landscape. So from here, I want to sort of tease out these 3 different themes. And the first one is this lived experience. So what does it mean to be sort of a religious queer person? And the key point that I want to drive home is that religion, in this case, Orthodox Judaism, but in talking to colleagues who study these dynamics in other religious communities, I know this to be true, that religion can be a destructive force, and it is a destructive force, but it also is a productive force. It is also can be a source of solution. So in the popular imagination, religious and queer is often thought of as an oxymoron. And so often people would ask me, well, what are you writing about? Or, what are you researching? And I would tell them, it's like, oh no, well, that's impossible. You can't be Orthodox and queer. And I would be, well, really? Because, I've just, talked to dozens of people who identify as that. And this is like their life's work and their life's mission is to make that clear to people like you. But this oxymoron, sort of what drives these perceptions is this idea that there's something inherently contradictory. And many religious traditions, and again, Judaism and Orthodox Judaism do not have a monopoly here, have a really horrendous track record when it comes to queer lives, right? People have been subjected to silencing, excommunication, outing, shame, conversion therapy, real physical, emotional, spiritual harms. So, and throughout my research, I came to, I heard numerous stories about how orthodoxy's messages and institutions and educational system and family create these kinds of harms, right? So people told me stories of shame and secrecy and denial and repression, theological angst, right? God must hate me, right? Which is a deeply disturbing thought for someone who is raised in Orthodox communities, and a lot of family stress. And over, people would talk about shattered life plans, and sort of what it would mean to come out would also mean to lose their community, and this yearning to be normal. So I have a whole chapter, which I always think of as like the dark chapter, the destructive, right? The religion as a destructive force chapter. So one man told me, Uli, that when he realized he was gay, he went through a period of mourning because there is a death. There was a dream, a big dream, and it was gone. And this dream, he said, was caught up in this idea about the normative Orthodox family, right? Which is very gendered. And, there's sort of the mother who sort of blesses over the candles, and the father who takes, does the kiddush and take the kids to shul. And it might reside in a settlement or in some coded sort of Orthodox Jerusalem neighborhood. And he said, this is like a scenery in a play. This is all around you. So, quote, the tragedy. So he said, when you grow up in such a home, in such a community, the scenery is all around you. What life is supposed to look like, what the family looks like, it rubs off on you, right? And the tragedy is that Uli, like many people I talk to, subscribe to this scenery, subscribe to this vision, and therefore felt that authentic Orthodox Jewish adulthood was out of reach for them. And Orthodoxy did not provide alternative images until these folks decided to get together and do just that. And I have a couple of images later that they started circulating. So the people I talked to who came of age before the mid 2010s, there was really little public imagery out there. And before the internet, they really didn't know that other people existed. There was no way to find anyone. And then there's family dramas, and that was such a central part of the story. Now, family dynamics are always central nodes in queer narratives, but for Jewish Orthodoxy presents a particularly rough terrain, right? There are a lot of obligations. Families are big. So there's always a bris, there's always some bar mitzvah, there is always holiday gatherings, Shabbat dinners happen, on a weekly basis, and there's grandparents and aunts, a lot of people that you have to take into account. So, for example, David said that his family was typical. So he explains the dilemma. My mom has 5 siblings. My dad has 4. We are all very close. Coming out was family drama. Went to tell the grandparents. What did the Haredi faction of the family say? What would the Haredi faction of the family say? Maybe delay after this cousin's wedding. My sister's getting engaged. Why ruin Passover? Over and over, right? This dilemma of who to tell, when to tell, how to tell, web of secrets around them. But and this is the key kind of the hopeful chapter that comes right after the depressing one. Religion turned out to be a very productive force for many people. Again, this is after they found each other, after they found a community, and after they began kind of to change the narrative. They began doing what I think of as sort of re-scripting, rewriting the script of Orthodoxy. And what I mean by this is that they used Judaism's own logic. Sure, they drew on general ideas about queer lives, and they drew on general ideas about empowering themselves. But they also drew on Jewish scripture. They drew on Jewish concepts in order to remake their lives. So here's an example. Jewish weddings. This, right? Jewish weddings, I always hope that someone will recognize, but yeah, no luck yet. Right. So Jewish weddings, we all know what they look like, right? I mean, they're very gendered affairs. The rabbi is male, right? I mean, people wear these sort of gender coded clothes, and, they stand under the chuppah, and the grooms breaks the glass and blesses the wife with a ring, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, what if you're a same-sex couple and you want an Orthodox Jewish wedding? What do? There's no script. There's no script. So many people told me that was actually empowering because now they could write the script. Well, how are they going to write the script? They would delve into the texts. They would consult with their rabbis. They would consult with their friends. And in community, they would come up with a Jewishly meaningful ceremony that was meaningful to them, that made sense to their families and to their communities. And it would be intentional. Do you want the chuppah? Do you want the glass? Hebrew is very, very gendered. So how do you adapt various blessings in that context? And that turned out to be a very, very meaningful turning point for people. And here is sort of one image. So this is two very, very prominent activists in the Proud Religious community got married in June 2017. And their wedding was, it was, and you can see just to the side, the ceremony was performed by a trans woman an ordained rabbi who was not, or the ordination was later not recognized, but an ordained rabbi who performed the ceremony, both grooms, right, coded a Jewish male breaking the glass, and this was basically live streamed on Facebook by many of their guests, right? So this kind of doubled up as public performance. It doubled up as an activist event, but it was attended by their families, by their friends, and many, many people in attendance kind of presented Orthodox. So people kind of wrote on Facebook, like Facebook Live, as this was happening, I'm witnessing my first Orthodox Jewish wedding because it looked and felt Jewish, right? It looked and felt Orthodox. So here's another example of how you rescript from within the tradition. One man told me that he felt that he was not going to be able to achieve tikkun olam, world repair, which for many believing Jews, this sort of refers to the expectation that one leave a positive mark in the world. And many can achieve this just by virtue of having children. But for this man who came of age in the early 2000s or mid 2000s, that did not seem like a plausible path. Okay, so at the time, it did not seem like he was going to be able to have children as a gay man. So he decided that his tikkun olam was going to be going to the Pride Parade with a yarmulke on. And the way that this was tikkun olam was that he was not going to be in your face. This was not, he was not attending the parade as some kind of in your face statement, but it was to teach. It was a teaching moment for the Orthodox communities to say, look, there are Orthodox gay people in your midst. And it was going to teach secular Jews that there were Orthodox gay people in their midst. So this is how another interviewee put it. She said, you can have a good life and it can be utterly boring, right? And by that, she meant you take your kids to school. You take your kids to, their gymnastics class after school. It's going to be conventional, and you'll just have a woman by your side instead of a man, right? You don't have to choose. And looking at it in 2025, this may seem obvious, but for many of the people I met, that was not obvious. That was not obvious. They made it happen. They made it happen. So I want to switch now to talking about how they made it happen, how they rescripted, how they came to articulate a new language, new social scripts, new rituals, and they did that in community. They found each other, they decided to band together, and they, right? So they were kind of activists. And so they created change in large part by building community. And my departure point for the whole project really was this puzzle that until really recently, for the young people maybe in the room, it doesn't feel so recently, but for those of us, who've been around for more than the century, right? It 15 years doesn't seem like a long time, but really within a span of about 15 years, Orthodox Jewish people in Israel went from being hidden, shamed, unseen, to embracing, to articulating this idea of queer Jewish identity, gay Orthodox, lesbian Orthodox, trans Orthodox, and really, really embracing their communities and building capacity within their families, within their larger communities, building bridges to rabbis as allies to help them with this process. So 25 years ago, so just at the turn of the century, this is Rabbi Shlomo Aviner, a very, very conservative, small c rabbi, said, and I'm sorry about the language, but this was the language then, there is no such thing as a religious homosexual. And he was right in the sense that people were not out. There was no public visibility, but people said, we were there. We were just not seen. We were in the chat, early days of the internet and various chat rooms, slowly finding each other. Fast forward to 2020, October 2020, this is Rabbi Benny Lau, who didn't just sort of acknowledge that, yes, of course, religious LGBT people exist, but issued a Jewish guidance for some, not all, but some queer couples and families. So not fully a psak halacha, right? So not fully a legal kind of guidance, but almost as close to that as you can get, because Orthodox queer couples were asking for halachic, for Jewish legal guidance, how to conduct their lives, right? There was no such guidance, and they felt that they were unseen, right? That they were invisible to the Orthodox world. So he issued this guidance in 2020. So we're really talking 15 years. And plot twist, so Rabbi Lau, if those of you have heard of Lab Shul in New York City, which is headed by Rabbi Amichai Lau-Levi, so a conservative, big C, or conservative ordained rabbi who sometimes performs as a drag queen. He is Rabbi Lau's brother. And really the main reason that Rabbi Benny Lau became such a prominent ally very, very early on. He learned from his brother. And there's a great documentary out called Sabbath Queen about Lau-Levi. So putting a plug in for that. So when Rabbi Lau issued these guidelines, this guidance, it was really a product of about 15 years working with a proud religious community, listening, engaging, learning from them. So what did they do? So some of their activism were drawn right from queer activism playbook. Protest, go to pride parades, speak up for your rights, public visibility campaigns, and I have examples in a minute. But others would seem very, very antithetical to queer politics. Talking to rabbis, like, what queer movement, which is really, usually associated with radicalism, like, you don't talk to religious authorities. You kick them out the door. So very, very nuanced kind of movement. So one of their key strategy, and I've alluded to this, they created capacity, they created communities. So these are three central organizations. On the right is Chavruta, gay men's organization. In the middle is Shoval, Shakol Bara Lichvodo. It's public education and outreach organization. And the last one is Bat Kol, Orthodox lesbian organization. In the past 2 or 3 years, both Chavruta, the men's organization, and Bat Kol, the women's organization, after years of fierce debates, changed their names to include queer. That took a very long time, sort of, to acknowledge gender diversity as well. But these organizations provided support. They provided community. They provided helplines, provided sometimes material support for people who were thrown out of their homes and had nowhere to go, and provided a community with which to talk, to figure out, to rebuild communities that were lost, and to figure out what it means to be Orthodox and queer. This is one example that I pulled, but of many for queer Bet Midrash, so Jewish study community. So taking texts and learning them with rabbis, with gender study scholars, developing a different interpretation of scripture, a different interpretation of the sources, a different ways of talking about what it means to be Jewish and how to think about the traditions and the rituals and where they come from. Another key strategy was talking to rabbis, and I talked about that earlier. For years, central activists would get together with rabbis and just talk about their lives. And this was often on the down low. Rabbis didn't want to be out, and I interviewed these rabbis, and they told me, well, for many years, I didn't want people to know that I was an ally or that I was supportive. But they would listen. The rabbis would listen. And many, often the activists would say it was very painful. They used sometimes really dehumanizing language, and sometimes they would just push back. But the rabbis were willing to engage and to listen. And the product of that was that they finally changed, the rabbis, sort of leaders such as Benny Lau and others, developed an understanding, a Jewish understanding of what it meant to live as a young Orthodox, or to grow up as a young queer person, or what it meant for people later in their lives who come to embrace their queer identities. So this photo is, we're seeing of key activist Nadav Schwartz, who is talking to an audience of rabbis and other sort of learned Jewish folks on the occasion of the publication of, again, not halacha, but as close to it as you can, about accepting gays and lesbian into Orthodox communities. This is not sufficient. It's not all encompassing, but it was the first time that a major rabbinical group called for that and explained why it was important and how it should be done. So in the conference where this sort of policy paper or halachic guidance paper was launched, Nadav Schwartz talked about how activists pushed back against the rabbis' understanding. There was one footnote that made claimed an equivalency between long-term monogamous same-sex relationships and a one-night stand. And the activists were enraged and they said, no, that is not the same thing. And even though it was in a footnote tucked away on page 7 somewhere, they said no. So Nadav recounted how he invited a rabbi to come with him on a night of cruising. So that he could understand, right, the experience of cruising. And then from that, maybe he would be able to comprehend the difference between that and long-term monogamous relationship. Now, that was not a real, right? That was all a theoretical, right? I mean, like, imagine sort of a chavruta and people are, going back and forth and kind of asking questions and throwing things around. So that was not a real, that was not a real proposition. But the point was the rabbis listened and they changed their own script. And this was a story that I heard over and over and over again from people who had been as part of that conversation. So this dialogue with the rabbis, I have a chapter in the book that I titled Educating the Rabbis. And I'd asked colleagues kind of to read the book before it was published. And one of them, who is a Jewish studies scholar and studies halakha, and she pushed back. She was, well, what do you mean educating the rabbis? Like, lay people don't educate the rabbis. I was like, no, that's exactly what I mean. They educated the rabbis. That was part of the point. The point was, who makes halakha? It's not just you learned rabbis. You need to listen to your people. You need to listen to the ground up. This is how we make halakha. So that's an important one. I mentioned the Shoval earlier. That's the organization in the middle. They run these workshops, and I attended several of those where people who identify as Orthodox and queer tell their story. 15 minutes. They do great trainings to help people kind of package their Orthodox queer story into 15 minutes. But at the end of it, they're standing up there in a room full of Orthodox people, and at the end of it, they say, "My name is," and I'm a gay Orthodox man, I'm a lesbian Orthodox woman, I'm a trans. And that is very powerful, right? That is very powerful for that room of people to hear someone say that, not as an epithet, not as anything negative, but here is someone from the community, someone who they can imagine, right? Their next door neighbor embracing that. So that's dialogue. And then there's a bunch of other, all the usual stuff that you can imagine with social change. This is an ad campaign called Our Faces, a collective coming out of a group of people in 2015. They published a beautifully produced digital album that had like a professional headshot and like their story, like who they are, where they grew up, where they went to yeshiva, where they, what high school they went to, and those were all coded as Orthodox. And sort of this collective coming out. And there were several other kind of big campaigns like that. So creating the visibility that people craved, so that when people like, Rabbi Shlomo Avinel say, well, there's no such thing as a religious gay person, they can say, oh, no, there is. I just read about them in the newspaper. Here they are. They exist. And there are many. And then, of course, this is from the Jerusalem Pride Parade. So this is another instance of rescripting. That large banner on the right says "Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha," love thy neighbor. Right? That's as Jewish as it gets. Right? So that is sort of a big the motto, and they're carrying. Some of them are carrying signs saying, "I went to this yeshiva. I went to this seminary." So again, identifying their kind of Orthodox street cred out in public. So like other social movements, the proud religious community activated numerous and sometimes contradictory mechanisms of social change, right? They were tearing things apart, but then working also from within to build something up, a different kind of wedding, a different kind of identity. These public visibility campaigns were huge because they created this other capacity for thinking about orthodoxy, and they used Jewish sources, right? Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. This is my tikkun olam. But one of the interesting questions is like, well, why did this work? And orthodoxy was ready. A lot of people, these rabbis, I mean, they could talk politics and they could negate and reject all they want, but, maybe it was their son, maybe it was their daughter, so they had to do some serious rethinking, or maybe it was a cousin, right? People knew people. And the Orthodox feminist movement had created a great capacity for rethinking about sort of orthodoxy and its things that it had taken for granted before. But the rhetoric of the movement itself was very, very clever and very authentic. And I think of this as a politics of moderation and authenticity. And what I mean was this, that they really, really insisted on working slowly and carefully from within, right? The talking to rabbis was really, really, really cultivated as a way for creating real change over time. And the other thing is that they claimed authenticity, right? This is one of my favorite quotes that I heard while doing my research is, all we want is a room of our own in the Jewish home. We don't want to tear down the Jewish home. We don't want to take away your family. We just want a room of our own. What is so threatening about that? And this is where I get to the third story that I want to share with you. And that is about the relationship between orthodoxy and queerness, and also between the Orthodox story and the nationalist story. Because the Jewish home is not just a religious home, it is also a nationalist home. And at the time, the Jewish home was the literal name of the most right-wing Orthodox party in the Knesset, right, in Parliament. I mean, it has dissolved. There are many others since then, but this idea of a Jewish home is both religious and nationalist. So one of the things that is important to think, why do people want to stay, right? If orthodoxy makes people's lives so hard, why do they insist on staying? And this is the reason. This is another key activist who said in an event that I attended in 2020, we insist on our place because we want to feel comfortable. This is where we came from. This is our community. We want to feel at home. But also they, the conservatives, we don't want them to feel comfortable without us, right? We don't want to make it easy to kick us out. At the same time, Orthodox conservatives, small c, think about these activists, the proud religious community. I mean, these really lovely, right? I mean, I always go back to where is this picture, right? These really lovely young people, right? As threatening. What is so threatening? And here is how one small c conservative rabbi explained, when someone comes and turns your family acceptance into communal acceptance, we will not accept him into the family. It is hard because it's our son. But if that's what they do with it, right? The Pride Parade, et cetera, if that's what they do with it, then they have to stop with family acceptance. If you do not disturb us, we will not disturb you. If he lives with his partner, it's his problem, not mine. Once he waves it like a flag, we cannot accept him. But who are the people that he talks about of like not being accepted? So on the one hand, you have these people saying, hey, we want to work from within, work with us, right? We don't want to rock the boat. We don't want to tear the whole thing down. We just want a room of our own in the Jewish home. And they're saying, don't disturb us. But these are your people. These are your kids. These are your nieces and nephews, etc. And here's where sort of the debate whether one can be is actually a debate of the sort of authentic balance of Orthodox Judaism. And a couple of quick points I want to make here. For a long time, this was like an intra-Orthodox debate. But then in the late 2010s, at the early 2020s, this really became a national battle for Orthodoxy's straight soul and really for Israel's straight soul. So if you remember between 2019 and 2022, I think it was 2019 and 2021, Israeli citizens went to the polls 5 times. This is how we got the current government. And with each step, it seemed that the tone around gender and sexual diversity became more fraught, more central to other kinds of sort of the politics, and really vile and violent. So This is the ad for Noam, which is now in the Knesset, in the parliament. Very, very right-wing party, very nationalist, very anti-Arab, and also homophobic, transphobic, anti-feminist, all of that package. This reads, Israel chooses to be normal. And the poll ballot reads that so that my son marry with a woman, right? So that was a collection of messages. This presented a real problem for these folks who have claimed all this time, hey, we're part of you. You know, we're your children. We're part of the community, right? For a long time, they kind of ignored the fact that they were asking for expansion of minority rights for gender and sexual minorities within the Orthodox community, right? We're part of you. They were talking about their oppression, right? In those terms, they were talking about their own oppression within the community, but not really about other axes of oppression in Israeli society or other axes of other minorities, and especially the Palestinian question, and intentionally not, right? And if they were asked, they would say, well, that is not our issue. That is not what we're about. We're just talking about our own rights. But when these kinds of parties became very, very central to Israeli politics, and they're even more central now with Smotrich's party and Ben Gvir, right? These are these are photos from the years of protesting the judicial coup, or the changes to Israeli laws. They began to feel that they couldn't escape that tension anymore. That tension between, well, can you fight one type of oppression? Can you talk about minority rights in one sense but ignore the others? Became really, really fraught. One man wrote on Facebook that he felt like he was being punched in the stomach when he realized that a lot of his family and friends were voting for these kinds of parties. So, and this is a tension. I don't resolve it. I can't resolve it. I just want to point it out because this is exactly the kind of tension that we're feeling in post-October 7th world. What is progress? What is progressive, right? Many Jewish people, especially right in the U.S., are feeling this tension that sort of natural communities don't seem to be so embracing and accommodating anymore. Some seem to be hostile. This is exactly the tension. How do you work for social change? Do you need to address all of it? Do you need to address all forms of inequalities, et cetera? I am realizing that I'm way over time. I wanted to say a few things about the North American context, but I could get to that in Q&A. I just want to say the changes here they're happening here as well. They're a little bit slower because the communities are not as close-knit, right? In Israel, people had access to these rabbis. Everyone kind of knows everyone. Often there wasn't the congregation, the other synagogue in town that you could go to. So you kind of had to stick with it. So changes have been slower, but they have been happening. And one of the most interesting developments is there's a case involving a pride club at Yeshiva University, and the university, which thus far has prevented them from receiving formal club status because it's against the Torah per Yeshiva University. That's making its way through the court system. But I won't say anything about that. I just want to say that there are lots of resources in the US. There are, and what can people do? Assume that there are, in Orthodox communities and others, right? I mean, there are queer persons in your lives. Be an ally. Be affirming, not just accepting, but really affirming and embracing. And then various organizations, Eshel provides support groups, and JQY Kishit. And I'm way, way over time. I apologize for that. And I will stop here and Sam will take questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And there is time for Q&A if anyone has questions. And if you do, just raise your hand and let me bring the mic to you because we're recording this event. And so with the mic, we'll be able to catch it in the recording. Yes, sir.
I've taken an interest in the early history of Christianity over the last 8 or 10 years of my life. And so recently I was listening to a lecture or a podcast. It might have been by Bart Ehrman in Chapel Hill, and but perhaps not. Evidently, in the emerging Judaism, at the post-temple Judaism, first, second, third centuries, in one of those traditions, had an understanding of sexual expression, if I'm using the right term, that was either on a continuum or 6 different expressions of sexuality. Is that something, am I imagining that, or is that something you're aware of, or I know I've come across it?
There's, there's this simplified version of history, right? Whether it's sort of religious history or just history in general, sort of thinking back with our own categories and sort of applying them to other times, other places, right? I mean, the whole idea of gender categories as we know them and sexuality categories as we know them, those are very modern inventions. Those are so people did not think in those terms, and different kinds of communities had different kinds of ways of organizing themselves. And I mean, we know from scripture, right, that other ways of living existed, right, both in Jewish scripture and Christian scripture, because in the Jewish case, rabbis talked about this, right? They tried to figure out what to do with different kinds of configurations and different kinds of bodies that defied sort of the normative framework, people who lived different kinds of lives. So if we don't try to project our categories and our ways of thinking, and frankly, our politics around our categories 2 times past, we might be able to actually extract a lot more useful information from the past. On the flip side, the past may not always be the best guide for how we should live our lives, right? So, yeah.
I don't know if this is gonna make sense. I don't know. Oh, is it okay? I don't know if his question's gonna make a whole lot of sense. I don't know a whole lot about Judaism, but like, how did I guess queer acceptance go? I guess for other Jewish communities. Do you know other than like Orthodox Judaism?
Much earlier and easier, but again, depending on time and space. I mean, listen, if we think about the US in the 1950s and 1960s, right? I mean, there wasn't a whole lot of acceptance in the general population, right? So the case of religious communities and how they come to acceptance and how they think about gender and sexual minorities in their midst is important because they're kind of the latecomers to the game. So I don't remember offhand, but if we're looking at reform and conservative Jews in the U.S. came to ordain, well, in the beginning it was just gay men, right? before women were ordained, but came to ordain, came to perform same-sex weddings earlier, and just be embracing and accepting. So we're talking, in the case of reform communities, maybe 30 years ahead of the game, et cetera.
Other questions?
Do you, excuse me, I'm sorry. What did you research much into like other queer identities than just gay and lesbian?
So I realized that I don't know how I skipped that in the beginning, right? So I started out talking to and wanting to research the whole terrain. I very quickly realized that it was going to be too much for one study. So I did talk to trans or non-binary, but several things. First of all, again, this is a very, very fast-moving train. So when I started, which is almost 10 years ago at this point, there were far fewer people who were willing to talk. But also the theological, right, the halachic, the Jewish legal, questions around sexual difference and gender difference were very, very different. And because we're talking about Orthodox Judaism, where halakha, right, where Jewish law matters, that had social and cultural implications. So I ended up narrowing in order to do justice to the terrain. But so let's say from the time I started to the time the book was published was about 6 years. When I started, the community itself used the terms LGBT without the Q, right? That was just like the terms that people were using. By the time I finished, more and more were using the term queer within the Orthodox community. So that's how quickly things change within it. When I first started, like Bat Kol, which is the lesbian women's organization, oh my God, they kept having visceral debates and blow-ups and people, factions were going to leave the group around adapting their language. Are they going to admit trans women? Are they going to rebrand themselves as the queer women's organization? And finally they did, right? Finally, they just realized that just had to be, but within a relatively short period of time. So sort of pragmatic reasons, but also sort of reflecting what the field looked like in 2016. Yeah. So that's a completely honest answer.
I think we have time for one more question. Okay.
I've had a few questions going around in my head. So
Okay.
I have to pick one.
Well, we can talk afterwards.
Okay, that one. So you mentioned almost offhandedly during your presentation that some of these families that are having these queer Orthodox Jews come out have parts of that family who are Haredi. How is this, if at all, if you know, reaching out and impacting that community to have their cousins and their siblings and their nieces and nephews and aunts and uncles come out as queer to them, if they're doing so at all?
Wow. So the Haredi community is like light years, right? I mean, light years behind the Orthodox, like what we would call here the modern Orthodox community in terms of embracing and even engaging, even the language, right? I mean, just does not exist. So mostly not a great story. Mostly not a great story. Chavruta, the gay men's organization, runs support groups specifically for men who come from ultra-Orthodox families, recognizing the difference. So everything is just magnified. Everything is just magnified. And if in modern Orthodox, right, in Orthodox circles, you find more and more families grappling, right? I mean, even if they're not all out embracing, also not cutting ties anymore. I mean, it still happens, but really, like that has been a dramatic shift. Not so much in ultra-Orthodox communities, but there's no community-wide conversation, right? There are no rabbis who are recognized as allies. Whereas in the modern Orthodox context, right, the folks that I would talk to say, well, these are our rabbis. And that, by the way, would apply to LGBTQ, right? I mean, the full spectrum. They would say, oh, these are our rabbis. Like I talked about Benny Lau, but there are many others. That just doesn't exist within the ultra-Orthodox world, right? And if there are no recognized leaders, then of course, right, the community is not going to follow. Within individual families, on the down low, sometimes, but the cutting off is still much, much, much more prevalent. Like that is usually the outcome, and the community support is much more important, right? Thank you. Yeah, that's.
Well, thank you, Dr. Avishai, and all of us appreciate bringing these to our attention, and also some of the connections you made at the end to contemporary issues. And we appreciate that it requires a lot of nuance, and we appreciate your sharing your research. Thank you again for coming tonight.
Thank you. Thank you.